one of your books, or as we call them books, but they're letters. And I just pray that you'll give me the words that I need to say, and that when I say them, that people understand them, and glorify you. All these things I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Today, more specifically, I'm going to talk about the book of James, but I'm going to talk. This is kind of more of a historical context deal. This is not really straight out of the book of James, and we'll get there. If you look at how that they call this book, along with some others, the seminaries will call this they're called the Catholic epistles. And what they mean by Catholic is the word general, or universal. And what they're saying with those terms is that they're when you have Ephesians, that's a letter to the Ephesians. Well, these books, and I'm gonna tell you what's under the categories, but they're not really a specific addressee. However, 2nd and 3rd John are. So we'll get it. But in this category, it's the book of James, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Okay? But that's how they fit. Now, you could argue and say, well, where does Hebrews fit? Hebrews is very interesting because in the history of the church, Hebrews had some problems. One of them was authorship, because the early church was trying to maintain and save these letters so they didn't get lost. But in the process, they really didn't know who wrote Hebrews, and so that's one that they're kind of like, well, does this fit or not? And so with the councils, they finally decided Hebrews fits, but they don't put it as this, and that's why. So if you want to have parts of your Bible say, well, maybe we can't use that, but take that for what it's worth. But these are, and we will get to the specifics about this, about author of James. And so every one of these books towards the end has two things going, big paintbrush themes. One is there's an ethical component that your job is to continue forward in faith, that you should continue doing, the things you should be doing in faith. They all also have kind of a reward theme from James all the way to Revelation. These books are talking about we're going somewhere, and if you persevere as a Christian and you follow the faith and remain faithful, there will be a reward for you in heaven. And maybe that's the best way to say that. The time of this letter of James, somewhere in what we call the apostolic age. Jesus has died, and the apostles are still around, and they are, serving and doing their thing. Just a second. I worked last night. Sometimes you never get hydrated enough. I don't care what you do, I don't think. But the time frame, like 30 to 66, is called the apostolic age because it's no longer the age when Jesus is around. It's after that. And until all the apostles die, that's where we have that. Now, James, and whoever James is, we'll get to who James may have been, was at the Church of Jerusalem. And you notice I said church, not synagogue, because they went from being Jewish with synagogues to a church. Now, church is a different definition to us, and I think the early Christians had that same definition in mind of church, as opposed to synagogue, because a synagogue is a building, and that's where you go on the Sabbath, Saturdays. For us, the church is us. It's the people. It's not the building. And so so he was at the Church of Jerusalem. However, they still have the temple. They still have, whatever. And so, I didn't say synagogue. And also the leaders of that church would be Peter and James. They said, I'm not going to get into James just yet. And at the same time, now Paul is the missionary to the Gentiles. So you've got Peter and James in Jerusalem, and Paul is off doing what Paul does. There is a historian around 160, so he's digging through stuff a little bit later. An interesting name, and I don't even know how to pronounce it for sure, but maybe Hegesippus, Hegesippus. And he was looking through documents and everything else, and they found some of the things that he's written about this. And he says that James maintained an intimate relationship with Judaism. So in other words, he was a Christian, but still working in the circles of the Jews in Jerusalem. They said he prayed in the temple, not the synagogue, but he would pray in the temple, which, like I said, it's a building, and I guess you'd say it's a synagogue, but it's different. And he'd pray for the salvation of Israel. So no matter who you were, if you lived in that city, like, okay, check, that's good. He's praying for it, for us. And he wore linen clothes, kind of like a priest, so that was kind of sticking still with the Judaic kind of thing. And they said that he was kind of ascetic, kind of like the Nazarenes. So it would mean that probably things like his dress was simple. He probably maybe didn't drink wine. Certainly they'd say never would say he was drunk or anything like that. And they said that he was peaceful and not a zealot. Well, what does that mean? And we're going to get into that quite a bit with this zealot stuff. A zealot is, in our terms, someone who has a zeal for a cause. Well, he had a zeal for Jesus Christ, but the cause that was occurring at this same time was the attempt to separate from Rome. And so they didn't like Rome's influence, and so the zealots were trying to say, we need to get the Romans out of here and take over back our country. He wasn't that kind of person. And it's one of the things, if you can argue that probably when you hear the term Judas Iscariot, Judas the Zealot, I think there's probably enough to say that Judas probably thought that the arrest of Jesus was a good thing, not a bad thing. He wasn't doing it to be mean. He was doing it because he thought, we get our guy up front, they arrest him, everybody's going to revolt, we're going to take over the Romans, and it's all good. He didn't foresee the future and so forth. But then it all tumbled down, and he felt, ashamed of what he had done. He didn't see the outcome, the consequences. Now Jesus got killed. He puts it on his shoulders. He ends up killing himself. So this guy, though, they said he had a nickname, which I think was good too. They called James was called the Righteous One. So that's a big prop. And the problem with this, and I'll get into this a little bit as well when we talk about who James was, but in a way, the Jews kind of looked at him not as a zealot, but anybody that did see him in action could pin on him that he's a nationalist. He is Israel, And then the other thing that is quite interesting about James, for one of the potentials, and I have to throw this out there, I have to open the box a little bit, that James may have been a brother of Jesus. And if that's the case, if you're following some of that nationalism and zealot stuff and trying to look back at history of Israel and look forward, you got to remember, he, like Jesus, was as a house of David. So there was a connection there that they may have looked at him differently, saying, he really is of our royal line. Maybe I'm going to put it that way. So there could be some of that as well. So you've got this is the time period. It came to an end when James died in 62 and Peter Paul died in about 64. Now we have Nero's persecutions going on about this time when those people died, and at about 65, which is kind of the number I gave you for the end of the apostolic age, all of I can't say all, but a lot of the Christians in Jerusalem, everything spread out. Jerusalem was not a safe place, not a good place. They left. Nero, um, you know, basically there were a lot of problems in the king the am I going to call it kingdom? It wasn't really a king, I guess. In the Roman protectorate or whatever, in that Roman area, there were a lot of problems, and Nero probably didn't do a lot to help it, and certainly was probably blamed for it. They had a big fire, and so they started blaming the Christians for the fire instead of blaming, oh well, this is what happened. It's kind of like, let's make the Christians a scapegoat. The other interesting, just small trivia, you've heard that Nero fiddled when Rome burned. Well, there actually is a true coin and some stuff, and there's some discussion that Nero may have been actually playing the bagpipes when Rome burned. And there's like a coin that has him with bagpipes, and so it may not have been he was fiddling. He may have, that's here to there, but that's a little bagpipe trivia that I know, and so it may have been that. But Nero, you get some politicians get so high they forget about the little people, and they don't really, who are you? Who cares? You're, and you get to some politicians in our world. I think that, oh, you're just a vote. You're not a, why should I listen to you? Because you don't have the picture I have. So the fall of Jerusalem, temple in AD 70, moving forward, just things kind of messed up. Nero ruled from 54 to 68. I told you that Nero was actually a staunch supporter of Greek civilization, and it's interesting that there was a lot. The Jews hated Nero so much, he created an enemy against himself within the Jews itself, and there was a Jewish revolt in 66. Now, a lot of this time that we know, and I know this is after the book of James, but we know about this revolt and stuff, is that there's a place, and I'm talking about the place because that kind of helps you put some things in perspective. Why am I blanking on it? In fact, I mentioned it yesterday. It's off my tongue now. There is a place right by that basically when you're up on the top of this thing, Masada, this place called Masada in Israel, and when you're up there, it's like if this was the rest of the world. This mountain is very tall, and you look down, and over there you've got the Great Salt Sea. And one of the things that was happening over there is they would take that stuff and they would dry it, and then they would take salt and take it to the rest of the world. And salt was, worth your weight in salt. Salt was a commodity. And so they could sell and trade salt for other things, because without it, how do you preserve your food and stuff like that? So salt's a big deal. And you even hear Jesus talking about, well, what good is if it loses its flavor? And, so salt, there was that salt trade going on, but you could look over there and see it. And then this valley was there's hills and hills, and there was a place between, but this valley had a good view of this. So Masada was built by one of, and it may have been Caesar Augustus, but one of the Jewish leaders had built this mountaintop. It was actually a tax station, but you can't really call it a tax station because along with taxes, that means you have money, and along with money, you need people to protect it. So they had built the top of this mountain as like a fortress to be able to see, and you could then say, hey, send some guys down there, go find out what those people are doing, let's tax them, like border control, customs, whatever you want to call it. There's all that kind of imagery. But they would get up there and they could see all the way around. And it's like this. They're up here and everything else is low. And so that place, I said, I've been there. Some unique features about it. It's rock. But it's rock that doesn't have a lot of splits in it. It's a solid kind of rock. And so you would walk up to a wall, and there was, they'd actually dug in I don't know if you want to, footpaths or whatever up this thing to get to the top. But you'd walk up to an area and they would be like at about this height, they would have dug into the wall down to about here. And this is solid rock. But they made a hole in here and they dug it all the way back. And what the purpose of that was, then they would take and etch into the wall like a footpath, very similar, but they'd etch in. And so when it would rain, the water would run in there and fill up that cistern. It was a cistern, a place to collect water. So the rain naturally filled those up. And they built multiple ones of them up at the top. So they had water. This is important to the story. They also, we know that they, up there on the top of that mountain, they could grow some food and they could keep some animals and everything else. It's a pretty big place. The reason that's important, and so that's what, they'd have a into the rock. They had dug in rooms to keep cash, and they'd have big doors and probably have guards guarding it, and the guards were stationed there. Well, that was during the Jewish times. Rome comes along. Rome didn't really need that outpost for anything per se. They had controls actually probably of both ends of this transit, whatever was going on. They had a big control of the region, not just that spot. So it was not something that I think that was really being used. And around this time, 66, there was a revolt by faithful Jews in Israel against the Romans. They were called Maccabeans, the Maccabean revolt. And a group of these people, probably one of the last holdouts of the revolt, and I'm saying it's my understanding at this revolt was males and females, but they retreated to this hill and they got up top and they protected. Now, this is when I'm talking, they were armed with weapons and trying to protect this place from Rome and trying to hold out. They wanted Rome gone. Rome started chasing them. This is where they ended up. But apparently the other thing about this structure is it was good enough that you could defend it pretty easily because they still have to come up those trails and you can throw rocks down on them and you can spears at them and do whatever you got to do, bows. And so Rome couldn't just come up there and go get them. They lost a lot of Romans trying that, and this isn't working. This will tell you how intent the Romans were to defeat this group of rebellious people. I understand there's males and females up there. I don't know how many and all that stuff, but the Romans were wanting to get them so bad that the Romans actually built. I said, imagine this. They built a dirt ramp up it. So they just hauled in dirt and kept going and going and going, and they just built up dirt until they got there. It took them years. And they're using labor from all the countries that they have conquered and whatever. And it like I said, it took them years to do this. And you can get up there and look around, and once you kind of know the story and you start looking around, and it's really clear. When you get out to the plain over here, let's say this is the side where the ramp is. When you get over here, there are still kind of areas that, not really a circle, but that kind of thing, and there's multiples of them. Those were all the Roman encampments. So the soldiers were stationed there waiting to get up there, and people were bringing in baskets of dirt with the Romans driving them to build a ramp to go kill these people. And at that site, what the Maccabeans did for this revolt is that when the Romans got there, basically they held out. They did it. It's like, I guess you'd say a Jewish equivalent of the Alamo. However, by the time when the Romans actually got there, they all had plans and they committed suicide. So the last person killed themselves, but everybody else had a plan to off everybody else. So the Romans got there and they'd all killed themselves, which, that'll tell you how angry they were at Rome. If you're angry enough to make sure that the Romans don't even get the satisfaction of killing you, but they did. And it would just boggle your mind to figure out. I mean, it would take a long time with our heavy equipment, taking loaders and stuff, hauling dirt to build what they built. But that hill did not have that ramp, and now it does. It's just a dirt ramp because then they could just take the troops, march them right up there to the top, and do what they needed to do. So there we go. During this time, though, um, the um, the Christians were kind of caught in the middle of all this too, because either you're for Rome or you're for the state, right? Well, that's a problem because Christians, we have a different flag. That's our flag. Yes, we may be Americans, but that flag actually takes superior to that flag. That's our flag. So it didn't matter that Rome was in charge, and it didn't matter if the Jews were in charge. To the Christians, God and Jesus are in charge. Okay, so that created problems too, because they want to know, well, which side are you leaning, and both sides had problems, and so they were caught in the middle. And the sad thing is, if you think about human beings, where you come from, let's face it, we still have this flag. It's here. It's us. We can never separate that belief and feeling. Not really. And so many of those people grew up in a Jewish home, went to the synagogue, the temple, all that stuff. So they still believe that they were Jewish too. And so there's a struggle even amongst themselves of who do we serve? Where do we work? Politically, how does this work? And so they had, now, like I told you, that Nero loved everything Greek. So you can see the response to that's going to be, well, we hate anything Greek. So even the Christians went through a phase of saying we don't like the Greeks, sort of. But if you look at it, the funny part of our Bible, what language is James writing in? It's Greek. So that can create some, ill will from the Jews and stuff like that too, because they're still using Greek language and they're writing it, and they're sending it. And so, at a time, at first, the leaders of the Jerusalem church, definitely tried to do their best to not have any provocation. They didn't want to make the Jews mad, because then that could be bad. They certainly didn't want to make the Romans mad either. So they're caught in the middle. But then they did have some, Jewish Christians who became zealots for the law, and you can find that in Acts, like 21:20. They talk about that a little bit. Let me see. I think I've got through. Okay, let's go to who James was. And the interesting thing too, just about the book of James, Christ is mentioned in the book of James 2 times in the whole. But it's got a lot of wisdom and everything else. It's been compared to Proverbs, Psalms, Sermon on the Mount. The author knows their stuff. They know the Jewish literature very well. And they said a lot of this book, though, is kind of an interpretation of the Old Testament law and the Sermon on the Mount in light of Christian ethics. Remember, it's a different thing for them. They haven't dealt with this. So they're trying to help them understand this is how you fit with this new law. You got the old law. This is how you fit Christianity with the new law. Anyway, the author of James, very, very early in the book, it comes out and says, I'm James, bondservant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's one mention right there, first sentence. And who are the potentials? James could have been James, the son of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, one of the 12. James could have been the son of somebody named Alphaeus. James could have been James the younger, which is the son of Mary and brother of Jesus. Or James could be the father of Judas. And so you have potentials. Most authors say it's James, the half-brother of Jesus. And he's mentioned first in our Bible in Matthew 13. One of the early church historians and theologians, Origen, is the first Christian writer who explicitly quotes this book as scripture, ascribing it to James, the brother of the Lord. And so if you want the references that I can give you, where we see these people all the way through here, whether it's James, the half brother of Jesus, that certainly when Jesus, there's kind of some stuff that when Jesus was alive, that James was an unbeliever, but when he dies, James gets to look and say, "Ooh, I missed it." And so he's full tilt at that point, and that's kind of true. Sometimes, I don't think we had full impacts of what some of our great leaders have thought and said until after they're gone. Martin Luther's a classic example of that. You read his sermons and some of his stuff, but at the time, people didn't fully. Some people got it, some people didn't. And so you've got, while certain people are alive, you just may miss it. You're a little too close to seeing what their vision was. We got U.S. presidents that at the time everybody thought, why are they doing this? And you look back and go, man, that person had it. But history judges. There is that maybe he was a cousin of Jesus as well, so we don't know. But somehow most of the scholars really believe that he is related to Jesus in some form or fashion. And I told you, he became the head of the church there with Peter. And then I'm going to get, let me just make sure I don't have anything else here. A lot of this is structure of a book. Oh, one thing that he also did was James convened the Jerusalem conference in AD 49 to deal with the Judaizing controversy in Acts 15. Are we Jews or are we Christians? What does that mean? And the interesting thing is that he took what would have been considered the side of Paul, ushering the Gentiles without circumcision, because Peter's like, if you're going to be like us, you got to be circumcised. And Paul was saying no. Well, James was on the no, you don't have to. Okay, so how did James die? James was actually murdered by the Jews. The people that he was around, the people he was, they murdered him. And there's a reference that he was murdered. Eusebius and Josephus, who are historians that we can rely a lot on that time, they're actually Roman historians, but they tried to put it all together. And they said that they feel like that he was martyred on the steps of the temple just before this Jewish war in 66 at a mob riot in about year 62. No, 19s. 62. Year 62. So that's how he died. He was killed and by his own people, however you want to look at that. And, so, I mean, was he, there's not a lot of speculation. We don't know if he was murdered or killed because there was just a riot and they said he's not one of us, or if he was a targeted thing because maybe the Jews thought that the Christian church was a challenge to Judaism, but it wasn't the Romans. Isn't that weird? And we know that Peter was killed by the Romans. Historically, the understanding is that they threatened Peter with crucifixion. He said, well, if it was good enough for my Lord, it's good enough for me. And they took him and they crucified him upside down. So if you see people with upside down cross tattoos, they may be talking about Peter. But James was killed by his own people. Okay. Looking at the book itself, I think it's a fair statement to say that all of these books of the Bible in the New Testament, they're all written with a purpose. But one of the purposes was that this stuff wasn't written right when Jesus died. They didn't know when this was going to happen, what's going to happen. And so I think for a lot of them, they were looking at Well, Jesus has left and he's coming back. But in terms of he's coming back tomorrow, he's coming back on Wednesday. He's coming back. I think in their minds they had one of two approaches of all of his apostles. Some of them, remember, before he reappeared, some of them went back to what they were doing. He finds a group of them fishing on, and he is sitting on the shore roasting, cooking a fish, and then they come back and realize it's him, and he kind of chastises them, says, "Guys, what was my life for? Because you've gone back to what you were doing before." And then some of them had the response like these guys, if we got to carry on the faith, we've got to do it. But nobody, I think, in their circles thought that all of this stuff that he had taught them and told them was just going to kind of wither away unless they started recording it. And so you get, like, that's why I think you get Matthew, his approach, Matthew's book, there's this whole genealogy section. This is who had who and who had who. That Matthew thought his job is to record that and link Jesus to royalty. That was his purpose. You get the book of John, not First John, Second, Third John, but John. John is, let's put it this way. In my understanding in seminary, and trust me, I know I can't get my head around it. But if you want to talk about something that philosophers and people like that can get real excited about, the book of John is very high-tech, high-level, philosophical a talk about the nature and who Jesus is. But it's using Greek thought. It's using some thought from the past and things that we don't use in anything else. And so, this whole statement is, and he was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That whole sentence, you get somebody, they can take that sentence and break it down and have hours of discussion. You're like, yeah. And so you get what I'm saying. There's these different books. Well, these guys are a little later in the game, but things are happening, and I think that they're a lot of what we have are letters because, in their world they're dealing with, and they can tell great stories, and this is what, Jesus and I, we did. But then it's not until they get to where they write it to somebody else that we have it caught. We have it recorded. And so that's James's is a letter just like these other books are letters. They just look a little different. And I think James looks a little different because, like I said, he is trying to tell people, keep up the faith, keep moving forward. God is coming, and then you move all the way to, the book of Revelation. John is stuck on Patmos and he's writing what he saw. And so I guess probably a good time to kind of maybe end with this. But I think that if you really want to kind of put this in perspective, and this is something I was thinking about just recently looking at this, people can try to deny that Jesus Christ existed. But then I'm going to have to say, well, if Jesus Christ never existed, explain the cross to me. How does that symbol make it this far? I can take you to cemeteries and there's all kinds of crosses. Where do those come from? I can move forward and I can say, well, maybe you don't believe in the creation story and all this other stuff, but yet the creation story is carried in other traditions and other historians. There was a big flood. I mean, you can't deny that. I can take you to West Texas. Carl and I were talking about, Michigan green and everything. I can take you out to that desert and I can walk around and I can find seashells, and we are miles from any source of water. And these are ocean shells, just like I can go to Galveston and pick up. Like, how the heck are they out here? There was water covered it. I can look at these books and I can say, Jesus didn't exist. We know more about things that Jesus said than we probably know about what Nero said. We've got the history. People have written it down and are carrying it. And it all connects. And so you're like, okay. And so this is just another breadcrumb that said, Jesus was real, not just some thought or whatever, but actually a real person and in historical perspective. And we may not know exactly who the authors were, but that early church, a little later, these guys are writing the letters, and they don't, they're not writing the letters saying, "Oh, I'm going to be a best published author in the world. I'm going to be on the top 10 list." No, they're writing a letter, like me writing a letter to Carl. Here, Carl, oh, you're having this problem. Well, let me tell you, here's how I'd solve this. Here's what I would work with. So anytime you read these things, if it doesn't make sense, you kind of have to look at them from the standpoint of maybe they're covering something, and what is it that they're actually covering? What is the controversy? Why are they writing this? We don't know both sides of the conversation. But that's kind of the thing with these letters, is trying to figure out what they were written for and who they are, who's the audience, and why they're doing it, and whatever. But these are real people, real congregations, real things that happen. I said, if the Romans come along, and you'd say, well, if anything, the Romans would have their interest, their total interest would be to say Jesus Christ never existed. We killed him, we wiped him out, and move on, end of story. How many countless leaders of the world that Rome conquered that we have no clue of who they were? We can go back a lot of times. It just boggles my mind. You can get more history in some of our portions of the Bible about some of the people that were rulers of Egypt and all these other things than you can from other sources. And what's interesting to me, even, I think it's kind of fun living in life because, I'll just give you an example. Back to Israel. We got to go to the temple. There was a parking lot kind of below the temple. We parked there, and then we went up. We got to this, and we came back, and that's where our car was. Actually, we didn't stop there though. Then we walked down to the pool of Siloam and came back up to our car, and that's what we did for the day. Well, that parking lot, the what are you going to call it? Historical and antiquities portion of Israel has gotten very aggressive about when something changes, we want to get underneath it. We want to dig it out and see what's going on. They found stuff there underneath that parking lot that have like coins of David. So we know David existed. I mean, way old stuff. They have, in other portions, they've excavated parts of Solomon's stables. Solomon's mangers, because I've seen one. Solomon's mangers, what you feed a horse in, it's like marble that somebody had dug out and put on pedestals. And so his stable, we think about a stable with wooden walls and everything. If that's how you're feeding his horses, can you imagine what the walls and everything else look like? It's incredible. I mean, it just boggles your mind. And this is for, growing up, this is for a horse? But the people taking care of Solomon's horses, this is his stable. So when he came in and somebody, hey, you want to go see my horses? They were like, this horse lives better than any human being I know. But yeah, it was incredible. So you get to see some of this stuff, but that's the cool thing about that parking lot is they were digging on the side of that parking lot where somebody had paved, and they were going to do something else with it, and they took the asphalt off, started digging down, and they find this stuff. We keep getting reminders that this really is true. All this stuff still fits. I just love that. People can say all day long you don't want to, but, Do you have the song, Give Me Jesus? I heard this morning, and this is kind of the way I wanted to end this.
Great day, and thank you for tuning in to A New Day Fellowship Church. We are so grateful that you joined us, and we pray that you were blessed by hearing God's living word. May his message inspire you to continue walking in faith, trusting that he is working all things together for your good. As we close out this service, feel free to leave a word of encouragement in the comments and share your testimony with others. Together, we can inspire and uplift those around us to live for God. Remember, this is your season. Hold on to his promises, stand firm in your faith, and watch as God does great things in your life. Continue to be blessed, and we look forward